Hello, everyone. I am Lindsay Shepard, Investigative Journalism Fellow with True North, and today on the podcast I have Mark Milke. Mark Milke, PhD, is a public policy analyst, keynote speaker, columnist, and author of 6 books and dozens of studies published across Canada and internationally in the last 2 decades. Mark's work has been published by think tanks in Canada, the United States, and Europe, including the Fraser Institute, the Montreal Economic Institute, American Enterprise Institute, Heritage Foundation, and Brussels-based Center for European Studies. In 2019, he was the lead architect of the United Conservative Party election platform and principal policy advisor to UCP leader Jason Kenney. So Mark's new book is called The Victim Cult: How the Culture of Blame Hurts Everyone and Wrecks Civilizations. His book just came out on Amazon.com and will soon be in bookstores. So, Mark, what is a victim cult? Let's start there, and then why don't you take us through the book as well and give us a bit of an outline?
Sure. The best way to define a victim cult is really a relentless focus on the past. Perhaps that's the best way to look at it. Look, there have been 113 billion human beings born on the history of this planet, and 7.5 billion of those are alive today. There's no question that people have been victimized in history and are now. So the question, though, is what do you do with that? If you've been a victim, some are, some aren't. Some victim cults, as I call them, are in essence fake. But there's a lot of truth, obviously, and a lot of reason why people feel aggrieved. Because when you have 113 billion people over the lifetime of this planet, there's no doubt that clashes occur and there's some nasty people out there, not to be glib about it. So, but the question is, if you're victimized in reality, but especially when you're not, the question is, well, then what do you do about it? How do you get past it? And especially, how do societies get past it? To me, that's kind of the key focus of the book, because when you look beyond just the individual level, I mean, I'd say to people when I was writing this book, do you know someone that thinks like a victim? And almost everyone would say yes, and they would tell them about a relative or a friend or somebody they work with. But what happens when you multiply that by millions of people? Then you literally get victim cults, as I call them. And think about what a cult is, right? You've got a core of people that kind of swirl around a common belief, a common understanding, and almost voraciously so, right? They're committed to it, for good or ill. And the danger with that is they can't see anything else. They can only see what they're focused on. And in the case of victims, again, fake or real, what they see is the grievance. And I think it's dangerous for them, and I think it's dangerous for society at large and even entire nations.
Great. And your book, I mean, it's very intergenerational. That's like my first observation of your book. I mean, your book, it goes through so many different time periods. It covers different like wars, genocides. It's not your typical like, oh, college students are victims book. You go into like so much more than that.
Indeed. I mean, the genesis for the book, as you know, is I've done some public policy on Aboriginal issues in Canada over 2 decades. And what I noticed was that some, not all, some First Nations leaders have become stuck in what I call this victim narrative. And it's not because many, Aboriginal, Indigenous people in Canada, especially in the past, have not been victimized. They have been. So there's a lot of truth, and I'm very sympathetic to the claims, if you can put it that way. I'm sympathetic to the argument that, look, there has been some terrible, tragedies imposed on Indigenous peoples in Canada. So I'm not unsympathetic to where that starts. But what I noticed over doing Aboriginal policy over several years, now 2 decades really, is that the attachment, though, to an older grievance or to the blame narrative prevented at least some First Nations leaders, not all, and I've got positive examples in the book of different ones, but it prevented some First Nations leaders from thinking, okay, but are we sure that what happened 100 years ago or 50 years ago is the reason, for example, for poverty today, or socioeconomic indicators or outcomes that are, say, less than the average Canadian? Are you really sure that that's the reason, is something that happened 50 or 100 years ago, that's the reason for poverty today? I mean, in that particular case, I actually look at the reserve system and say that, to me, is more the original sin than anything else. A lot of reserves are in the middle of nowhere. There's no opportunity. It's not like you can bring a university to a reserve. It's not like you can bring a cement plant to a reserve. I mean, except for a few lucky reserves near opportunities where I grew up in Kelowna. So the West Bank First Nations Reserve, or the gentleman who wrote the foreword for me, Ellis from the Haisla First Nation, unless you're working with natural gas companies on the coast of British Columbia. A lot of the reasons sometimes people suffer are not necessarily the reasons they think. And what I noticed with some First Nations leaders in Canada is that they were relentlessly focused on what happened in the past and would link that to the present, and we see that time and time again. And that can be quite dangerous because you may misdiagnose what the problem is, why you are in the situation you are today, whether you were victimized or not.
Yeah, so you briefly mentioned Ellis Ross. So he's the chief of the Haisla Nation, was that correct?
An elected chief counselor for the Haisla First Nation before he went into politics, yes.
Yeah, and he wrote the foreword to your book, and you mentioned you saw him speak. So what is it about this particular case that kind of overcomes the victim narrative in your eyes?
Sure.
And what he's done for his nation.
Sure. I mean, jumping ahead to kind of how do you get past victimhood, because it's debilitating, right, for the individual and dangerous for societies. So Ellis, in his foreword to the victim cult, talks about he as a counselor when he first got on the council at the Haisla First Nation. He started to look back into the archives of Haisla. And of course, the Haisla First Nation, like many Indigenous communities, many Aboriginal communities on the coast and elsewhere in Canada, were really victims of what? Apartheid. I mean, there's no other way to put it, right? The British, who I have some sympathy for in terms of running an empire, were nevertheless, like many Canadians early on, racist. There's no two ways about it. And so until 1960, Aboriginal Canadians didn't have the vote. And there were many other harms done to Aboriginal Canadians in Canada. So Ellis started to look at his own historical records in the Haisla First Nation and saw the same pattern of abuse, of course, and discrimination and apartheid. There's no other way to put it. And he became very angry. But he very quickly figured out that that wasn't going to get the Haisla anywhere. So he started to think of, okay, what could deliver us from the situation we've been in and the poverty that he saw around him. And in his particular case, I think he always had a bit of a business mind and also a forward-looking mind. And so he started, on council and later on when he became an elected chief councillor, to really push ahead economic development. And in the case of the Haisla First Nation, that had a lot to do with energy development on the coast of British Columbia. So working with natural gas companies and saying, look, there's an opportunity for both of us here, but you can't just come in and develop. We need to be part of this. And as it turns out, now he says, look, he gets complaints from, for example, a single mom who says, I'd like to work 7 days a week. I'm only working 5 days a week. Those are the sorts of complaints he gets now. And they've never looked back, he says. But when he was on council, he had some people that said, you should, in essence, exploit the residential school story. And he said, look, and this is what I heard in Calgary and why I asked him to write the foreword. He said, look, my parents have gone to residential schools. He never thought of himself as a victim. They never thought of themselves as a victim. And he rejected that approach because he didn't think it would be helpful. And he honestly didn't feel like a victim. He kind of stood up to himself and recognized that his own problems, and he categorized some in his Calgary speech that I heard, he recognized that his own problems stemmed in large part from his own choices, and that he had choices. And I guess that's a key point when you think about victimization, right? Because again, there's no shortage of real victim examples in history or now. But the key thing is if you get stuck there as a person or a society, in essence, what you're saying is other people will forever have control over me, and that I have no agency. I have no human agency and no choice in my response. And that's actually very dangerous because then you go in a circle and it's a downward spiral. Whereas I think people that can progress out of the victim cult, and entire societies that can do that somehow find a way to say, I'm not, it's not, it's obviously not positive what happened in the past, but we better find a way to move forward. But yeah, there are lots of examples of that around the world. But I had to start in the book, of course, with looking, okay, what's the problem? The problem really is the victim cult, and I can give some examples of that.
Yeah, so I mean, the title of the book is The Victim Cult, and then it says how the culture of blame hurts everyone and wrecks civilizations. So do you want to talk about how does this hurt everyone
Sure.
and wreck civilizations?
Sure. I mean, I start the book by looking at real and fake victims. I mean, the fake victims, in one sense, are easy to spot, right? Someone at Yale in 2015, there was a famous event just around Halloween, so just 4 years ago now at Yale, where the Yale administration sends around an email to students saying, be really careful about the Halloween costumes you wear. Well, a couple of masters at Silliman College, who in essence looked after students at Silliman College, one professor, Erica Christakis, writes an email back to her own students who complained about this very patronizing email from the administration and says, look, this email from the administration was kind of over the top. I pretty much have faith in you as students to do the right thing in Halloween and not wear offensive costumes. That was the tone of her email. This thing exploded in her face, though, because some on campus really thought they were victims of potential Halloween costumes. She was literally, she had to leave campus for a while because of death threats. There was a march of 1,000 students at one point, 1/5 of the undergraduate body at Yale University. There was a march on the president's home at midnight of 200 students, about 200 students one time. Her husband, Nicholas Christakis, is confronted on campus grounds by students who are basically verbally accosting him and arguing with him, but it's almost mob-like behavior. And one student in particular of Nicholas Christakis says, this used to be a safe space for me on campus at Yale, and now it's no longer this.
Create an unsafe space here for all. Stay quiet. For all standing students. You understand that? As your position as master, it is your job to create a place of comfort and home for the students that live in Silliman. Step down! If that is what you think about being a master, you should step down! It is not about creating an intellectual space. It is not. Do you understand that? It's about creating a home here. You are not doing that.
I mean, think about the absurdity of this, right? This is Yale. Everyone that graduates will make six figures for the rest of their life.
And I mean, she's shrieking while she's saying this too, like absolutely shrieking. It's a viral video, yeah.
Yeah, this video goes viral across the country and the world. But she thinks of herself as a victim. And fake victims are easy to spot. Donald Trump in 2015 and 2016, the self-proclaimed Manhattan billionaire, thinks of himself as a victim of what? Talk show hosts, of judges, of immigrants. I mean, it's ridiculous. So the fake victims are easy to spot, and you would hope that their narrative doesn't go viral, but sometimes it does. The greater danger, though, and this is kind of where the historical element of the victim cult comes in. When I started this research, like I said, it started with the thought that some First Nations leaders dwell in this victim narrative, and that's, I think, dangerous for their own First Nations and for Canada in general. But as I started to do the historical research for the book, I saw this as a pattern again and again and again in human history. If you go back to the early Roman Empire, you find pagans that think of themselves as victims of Christians, right? When there's a flood, who do they blame it on? Christians, right? This new breakaway Jewish sect, in essence. Early pagan Romans blame floods on Christians. Then Christians get into power and they blame their troubles on pagans in Egypt and trash libraries in Alexandria, Egypt, right? Alexandria being one of the classical centers of knowledge in antiquity. So you see this throughout history. I mean, one of the fascinating and dangerous, arrivals of a victim cult is from Germany. Long before the National Socialists got into power in 1933, I focused 2 chapters on 19th century Germany, well, one chapter of 19th century Germany and then another one on Adolf Hitler. But the chapter on 19th century Germany, think about this. Most people know, of course, of what happened in 1933 and beyond once Adolf Hitler and the Nazis come into power in Germany. But I don't think most people are aware that this sort of were victims that was prevalent in 1933 and beyond, victims of the world, victims of the Versailles Treaty, as Hitler and Germans claimed. I don't think most people are aware that this sort of victim talk started early on in the 19th century. And in essence, or in truth, in fact, Germans were victims. They were victims of the French, who had occupied parts of southern and western Germany in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And Napoleon was in power at that time. Now, after kicking Germans out of, kicking the French out of Germany in the early 1800s, what you find is what people often are grappling with after they've been victimized. They need to kind of restore their own identity, right? Because they feel they've been violated. And so there's an understandable response about who am I on a personal level, but even entire nations can kind of grapple with this. Well, who are we, right? We've been oppressed for a while here, for decades in the case of Germans, for other societies, sometimes for centuries. And so there's a natural attempt to say, okay, who are we, and how can we exert our identity now? So what Germans did, though, is they sort of romanticized the past. They looked back 800 years to Frederick the Great, to Barbarossa, and they wanted to make Germany great again. And again, it's an understandable response, but it was a dangerous reaction in Germany in the early 1800s, because what they did is they focused on a notion of pure culture. And they thought, if only we can be pure again, pure Germans. And they went down this pure culture road a century before they ever got into notions of pure race. And in the early 1800s, they began to read philosophers, and philosophers urged Germans to think of themselves as only authentically German if they were Protestant, if they were Christian. And of course, this excludes Jews. It excludes the English, right? 19th century Germans didn't care for the English. They didn't care for British liberalism. And they really saw the collective as much more important than the individual. And this, as they were trying to kind of restore Germany as a great nation, and figure out who they were culturally. So it's a long answer to a short question, Lindsay. But it's what I found fascinating about Germany is this is where the problem starts. And Germany's victim cult goes viral starting in the 19th century, starting with the notion of pure culture and then later pure race. And of course, the Nazis and Adolf Hitler pick up on this in 1933, and we know the results. And the only thing that finally vanquished this mentality of victim thinking from Germany that had been there for 150 years was, of course, the Second World War, where Germany is utterly and rightly utterly destroyed. That's the only thing that psychologically knocks this very debilitating and dangerous and genocidal belief out of the Germans by 1945, right? By the rest of us combating Nazi Germany.
Yeah, and to pick up on this idea of pure culture, it's still actually alive today with hurtful effects. So you bring up in a chapter the case of Indigenous children who, in the US and Canada, who are put into foster care, but then there are these kind of claims over, well, the Indigenous children can't be living with families of other races. They need to be returned to their tribe or their reservation. Can you talk about that a bit?
Sure, and this was one of the interesting things about culture. I mean, culture is important. All of us have a set of assumptions. If you lived in 2 years in Japan, there's things about Japanese culture I like. If you grow up in the West, you have certain assumptions about individualism. If you grow up on a Native American reserve or a Canadian First Nation, you're going to have certain assumptions about how the world should be. And we live with that. And if culture is interfered with in a dramatic way, from an outsider, it can upset expectations. And literally, whether it's a small community or an entire nation, then all of a sudden your world is turned upside down. So cultural damage is real, but it's not exactly the same as, say, physical damage. But these days, people equate the two, and that's the danger. And again, especially with kind of the historical understanding of when people and nations try and recreate a pure culture that, in essence, never existed, right? Or the purest cultures in the world are not necessarily as tolerant as you think if you go back into history, right? Because they don't really intermesh with other cultures and think about other people's viewpoints, right? I mean, you think before the age of mass travel, for example, most people don't really have a great understanding of other cultures except their own. So this throwback to pure culture that it will save you, no, in essence, what it makes you is an identity isolationist. Now, in the case of a couple of examples in the chapter you mentioned with Indigenous children in the United States and Canada, the history to this, again, is an actual injury that occurred. So in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, in both Canada and the United States, there were times where children were taken away from their Indigenous parents. And like in any other sort of child, what do you call it? I mean, when children are taken from the home by social service agencies, sometimes there were legitimate reasons, right? There might have been a potential harm to the child, or there had been harm to the child. But in the case of Indigenous Canadians and Americans, there were also times where they were taken away simply not only as an emergency precaution, but sometimes there was no chance to get your child back if you were an Aboriginal parent. You were just assumed unfit. right? And there was no chance to, even if there was a legitimate concern, kind of rebuild that family relationship. And that was a tragedy, of course, and there was no doubt some racism behind that. Now, the danger, though, is, and there was some U.S. legislation and Canadian policy starting in the 1970s, 1980s that said this is wrong, as it was. We need to be more careful. We need to protect the Aboriginal family. That's fine. That's a good impulse. What happens, though, then is more recently, there's a veering off into, again, kind of thinking that what any child needs is a dose of their own pure culture. So I use the example from the United States first. I go into Veronica, a child in Oklahoma whose parents, the mother, is about half Hispanic. The father is from the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. They have a relationship. Child is the result, or a coming child is the result. But the father wants nothing to do with the child. The mother arranges an adoption before the child is born, an adoption of who will become Veronica. She gives the child away after the child is born, after Veronica is born. 4 months later, the father changes his mind, says, look, I want Veronica in my life, goes to court. To make a long story short, though, it goes through the court system. He wins. He gets the child back who he's never met. And the adopting family, the parents there, also go to court and fight for another 2 years to get Veronica back. Veronica is split between two families over 4 years, including one. She's in a family for a father and a stepmother she's never met. And this is on the basis of the fact that she's literally got 1% Cherokee blood in her, but her Hispanic blood counts for nothing. And this is because of a U.S. law designed to do the right thing, which is to try and keep families together. But eventually the U.S. Supreme Court says this is crazy. This is not a family that was split apart by an unjust application of a law. This child was never with her father. Her father initially never wanted her. And now she's given to the Cherokee First Nation and the father because of 1% Cherokee blood. I mean, this is the craziness where we're starting to divide people on this basis. And how do you, I mean, when you think about it, how does 1% Cherokee blood trump 50% Hispanic blood? I mean, the fact that people would even start to have these discussions shows the absurdity, first of all, the concept of race, but also, and I give other examples in the victim cult, of where other Aboriginal parents in the United States deliberately gave their children away, and not to parents from their own tribal nation, tribal government, as Americans like to refer to their reserves. They deliberately didn't want to give their children over to someone on reserve, and yet those children were dragged back to a reserve that they were not born on, where the parents gave birth far away from. And yet, because of certain laws and how the policies are enacted, these children are supposed to be placed only within Native American families. And that also interferes with the choice of the parents. So in essence, what we're saying is Indigenous children are always the property of the reserve, always the property of the collective. And that's very dangerous in human history as well. We're not treating people again as individuals. And that was the mistake in the 1960s and 1970s, excuse me, and before, when non-Aboriginal Canadians and non-Indigenous Americans didn't treat Indigenous North Americans as individuals first. Instead, they simply saw them as some collective which they discriminated against. The same problem is repeating itself now. We're not looking at Indigenous Canadians and Indigenous Americans as individuals first and members of a collective second.
Yeah, and I think it's hard when it's coming out of a good intention, because in Canada, I think we refer to the taking of Indigenous children as the 60s scoop back then. And I think we're even in talks of reparations for 60s scoop victims right now. Are you up to date on?
I believe, yeah, there are demands for compensation. And again, this is a difficult historical one to sift through. I mean, I assume most of the paper records are gone by now. Patrick Johnston, an historian who came up with the term, a Canadian historian who came up with the term 60s scoop originally, fully acknowledges that some of the takings of Aboriginal children in the 1960s and the 1970s were legitimate, right? If there's dangers if there's dangers from a parent or they're neglectful, it doesn't matter what your heritage is. The government, I think most people are rightly thinking that you should have the children taken from you if you're not a capable parent at that point. Again, the key mistake decades ago was Indigenous parents were not given the chance to reform the families, and some of their children were simply adopted out sooner rather than later, and that was part of the tragedy. But I don't know, looking decades later, how you necessarily sift through the compensation issue unless you can prove that really the state was in some way doing the wrong thing in a particular instance. So I guess lawyers who will sort through this to hopefully figure out which cases are legitimate and which cases no. Provincial governments were entirely within their rights and duties to separate children, at least temporarily, from their parents who might have been abusive or incapable of caring for the children in a proper way. And here's where I get into in the book, in the victim cult, the case of compensation or restoration and restitution. I mean, this is very much a topic alive today, not only in Canada, but in the United States, right? Some Black Americans, such as Ta-Nehisi Coates, wrote in this about 5 years ago in the Atlantic Monthly. And Coates argues that Americans should compensate for slavery. So I address this in the book because liberal democratic nations do, in some cases, try and address past wrongs, right? If you get your property stolen tomorrow, you can go to court and say, listen, I, Lindsay Shepherd, have had my property unjustly taken by the state. I want compensation. And in fact, we have laws and policies that are designed to compensate you. Should some bureaucracy overstep its bounds here, you're entitled to compensation if they steal your property. We compensate people if they've been unjustly imprisoned. Convicted and imprisoned. So there is a precedent for this, but the question is, how far do you go back? And in the book, what I try and suggest in one of the chapters in the victim cult is, okay, let's think about this sensibly. If you or your family, perhaps, right, your parents, maybe your grandparents, were treated unjustly by the state, I do think there is some case for compensation. But beyond that, the further you go back, the weaker the case becomes. I mean, think about this in terms of a modern courtroom. If we go to court and try and prove a claim, there are conflicting claims, there are conflicting memories. Memories are faulty. We know this in a court case. It's difficult enough in the present to prove that I've been harmed by somebody, or that I did something wrong or they did something wrong. And that's why lawyers get paid to argue back and forth in court to try and sift through this. And this is what judges and juries have to sift through. But now, add the weight of history. Are we really sure, going back beyond maybe our parents or our grandparents, that we can prove who genuinely was at fault? And more importantly, that my situation or your situation today is due to some choice made by someone 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago? But yet you have people that say, my situation today is a result of slavery 200 years ago. Or in the case of Indigenous Canadians, my situation today, in some cases, is a result of what happened in 1867. I think that weak becomes very, very linked. And in fact, the danger, again, is that people think that that's the reason they're in a certain situation today, as opposed to maybe their own choices or maybe some other factor. Again, the clearest example is, look, First Nations reserves, many of them, are in the middle of nowhere, not near opportunity. That is more the problem, I think, in many cases, than what happened 150 years ago. Or to give you another example from the United States, economist Thomas Sowell, who's a Black American, one has to say that these days, has argued for years and shown that, for example, Black American families were pretty much together in the 1930s, but started to break down in the 1970s and 1980s. And Thomas Sowell, who I quote in The Victim Cult, in essence says, look, you can't blame slavery for family breakdown in the 1970s or 1980s. The two-parent families were the norm in the 1930s. And they only started to break down 50 years later. So you really can't blame the evil of slavery on what happened 100 years later. You can blame it on 1890 events, or early 19th century events. But even then, you're getting away from slavery. So the question is, what's the cause and effect? But the further you go back into history, I think the weaker the link is to present circumstances.
Yeah, and so related to this idea is that of public apologies, which you give some time to in your book. So Justin Trudeau, you mentioned in his previous 4 years of office, he was recently reelected. So he gave 8 public apologies for historical wrongdoings. This was obviously before his time, and he had nothing to do with those wrongdoings. So what's with these official public apologies that we're doing here?
Right, and even the BBC had a headline a couple of years ago saying, "Has Justin Trudeau apologized too much?" Look, on a personal level, apologies can sometimes be very helpful, right? Because they take the sting out of an offense. Then it helps us deal with the initial offense, and forgiveness is a good thing. I'm a little more skeptical, though, of public apologies or government apologies, because I think they're often politicized. And a good example comes from British Columbia, to the Tsilhqot'in Nation. The first Chief Justice of British Columbia, Justice Begbie, was known as the hanging judge, because I guess he did sentence a lot of people to hang, as happened in the late 19th century. And in one famous incident, there were 6 Tsilhqot'in chiefs sentenced to hang over the course of 2 years, 5 in the first year, I think it was 1885, and the second in 1886. Now, why did Judge Begbie sentence them to hang? Because the 6 Tsilhqot'in chiefs had murdered over 20 people who were road building through the territory, or most of them were road building through the territory. Now, look, a century later, more than a century later, a century and a half later, this is interpreted as a racist judge who was simply trying to conquer British Columbia and enforcing British colonial rule, obviously in a very dramatic way, in an unfair, tragic way, we would say, or some would say. Okay, but that's the very simplistic view of the situation. As left-wing journalist, as one left-wing journalist, though, wrote about this, and I quote in the book, and I quote in the Victim Cult, he points out that Justice Begbie actually was unusual for his time. He actually thought it was wrong for the British to simply go in and take land. He was in favor of our Aboriginal title. He actually sided with the Chinese community in British Columbia against racist laws from white legislators. He sided with women, who were often also in British Columbia on the receiving end of discriminatory legislation, and he often commuted the death sentences of Indigenous British Columbians at the time, who were 3/4 of British Columbia, the British Columbian population. Judge Begbie commuted their sentences more often than not, and that's something he never did for non-Aboriginal offenders. So when Justice Begbie sentenced 6 Tsilhqot'in chiefs to hang for murdering over 20 people, he didn't do this lightly, and it wasn't part of some racist intent. He was upholding the law in British Columbia at the time, and I think this, one can argue this back and forth. Well, there were 20 people in Tsilhqot'in territory, and maybe shouldn't have been there. But you can argue back, as some would, and say, yes, but that doesn't give anybody the right to premeditated murder. And that was obviously Justice Begbie's view at the time. So for Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister, 150 years later, to apologize for this, it's really a simplification, and I would call it a Disneyfication of history. And that's the problem with kind of a victim narrative, is it really takes out the gray from history or the contrary facts and simply politicizes it for present political ends. And I'm not sure it changes anyone's mind. I mean, you either think that the Tsilhqot'in were right to murder more than 20 people in the 1860s, or you think nothing gives people the right to premeditated murder.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, I don't know if you followed this case, but this summer there was a statue of Begbie in New Westminster. I think it was outside of a post-secondary institution called the Justice Institute of British Columbia. And there's also a street called Begbie Street in New West. But anyway, so the statue of him, they took it down this summer because of these reasons, that he's, a racist judge who hung these 6 chiefs, or hanged. And yeah, so I was shocked when I read in your book this kind of more complicated history, because that was not the narrative. I just looked over the CBC article about that statue removal this morning, and it just is about kind of, like a whole bunch of Indigenous people cheered when the statue was taken up because that presence was very hurtful. And I'm just not sure, was this history known? Because it's a lot more complicated than just he's a racist and he needs to disappear. And I suspect it wasn't known, right? And that's why people cheer when statues come down, because they often don't know the complicated history of that particular person. And statues are another thing I address in the book, as you know. I mean, I go into this kind of anti-Western civilizational motivation for some victim cults. Where really at heart, what it is, it's an anti-Western kind of animus
which again simplifies history. I mean, look, no one in a perfect world, there wouldn't be any wars, and we'd all be fat and happy and peaceful and prosperous. But that's not human history when you've had 113 billion people in the history of this planet and 7 billion now. Not only will mistakes occur, but empires are going to clash. So the question is, what do you do with that? I mean, one of the interesting things is on this point, I was in Hong Kong a few years ago, and there were three things. I met politicians and civil servants and business people in Hong Kong, and to a person, they don't see themselves as victims of the British, for example. In fact, and everybody I think knows this now with the protests going on in Hong Kong, at the time when I was there in 2013, all of these people I met said there were three things we want to keep in Hong Kong vis-a-vis the regime in Beijing. They said capitalism, the rule of law, and our anti-corruption efforts. And they were afraid of losing all of that to the morass that is China and the rulers in Beijing, where corruption is rife in the courts and in business and in politics, where capitalism is really crony capitalism. And they really valued those three items in a way that I'd never heard here. And so one has to be careful. I mean, when empires clash and civilizations clash, and they always do you simply throw out the baby with the bathwater, to use the famous cliche, or do you, as Hong Kong residents, recognize, say, actually the rule of law is a good idea. Capitalism is what has lifted up billions out of poverty over the last 70 years in particular, and protected Hong Kong from what was going on in China. I mean, but these are things people have to think through. But if you simply think of yourself or your culture or your society as a victim, there's no nuance. Everything is black and white. And I address this in the introduction as well. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the famous Soviet dissident, once said it's really tempting to think of oneself as pure, and this is a danger, and one's culture is pure, and that the problem is always somewhere else, someone else. And if only we get rid of them because they're evil, then we shall be restored to whatever, our natural, pure environment, or all shall be well. And Solzhenitsyn was very wise. He understood human beings, and the real problem is not necessarily, it's not often, the division between societies or nations or civilizations. The division that matters is within our own human hearts. So good and evil are in each human heart. And Solzhenitsyn pointed to that and said, be really careful about thinking if you stamp out that other person, that you will get rid of evil, because the evil is still in your own heart. And this is a person who was in Soviet gulags and Soviet concentration camps and saw evil up close. And the temptation was always to think that the problem was in the other person, instead of understanding that it's much deeper than that. And one has to be very, very wary. And this is the problem. And this is, we can understand, again, the reaction when one is a victim and one wants to lash out. But the danger in doing so is that brings up the worst parts of our own nature, and we lash out and blame. I mean, at the very beginning of the victim cult, I start with the Genesis creation narrative, right? Cain and Abel. So for your listeners who are not familiar with the Cain and Abel creation story, the narrative, Cain and Abel sacrifice the fruit of their labor really to God in Genesis, in the first book of Genesis. And what God does is he rejects Cain's because it's vegetables, and apparently that wasn't a good sacrifice, and he accepts Abel's. Now Cain is mad as heck about this. And in one sense, you could say, well, it's unfair. How does Cain know that he couldn't sacrifice vegetables? There's no indication in the Genesis creation myth that God ever told Cain, you have to, bring me a lamb or something. And so we can even sympathize with victims. We can sympathize with Cain and say, maybe God treats you unfairly. But what does Cain do then? He never addresses the source of his problem, which is the deity, God. He never talks back to him. And we have other examples in the Old Testament where people talk back to God and actually win an argument. People forget this, right? Cain never does that. Instead, he looks for someone to blame. And this is what I mean by the culture of blame wrecks civilizations and wrecks communities. Cain looks around, and who does he see? The closest person that he can blame is his own brother Abel. And he murders Abel in a field, and God comes back to him later and says, what have you done? And Cain basically lips off God. And he has to live for the rest of his life with the knowledge that he murdered his own brother, his mother's son. And so this is the problem with thinking like a victim. Even if one is a victim, if you dwell on that and become bitter, it's debilitating, and in some cases can turn murderous and genocidal. And it's a bit heavy, but that's a lot of what the victim cult is about. I try and go into these warnings to people. This is very dangerous for you personally, but it's also dangerous for your civilization.
Well, then let's go into, we mentioned one success story at the start of the interview with Ellis Ross of the Haisla Nation, but there's also one other notable success story we could focus on here of a group of people overcoming the victim narrative. And that's the story of the East Asians. Is that correct?
Right. So put yourself back in 1850 or 1840. I looked up historical examples, historical examples from California and from the rest of the United States. There was some great historical research done on early Asian Americans. The first Chinese person to actually reach, or Chinese people to reach the American shores, were three sailors in the 1830s, where their ship docks, their captain takes off to go marry someone, elope with someone, and they're stranded there. Eventually, I guess they make their way back to China. The next person in the United States was Afong Moy. She's literally a museum exhibit in New York and the Northeast United States in the 1830s. People are watching her use chopsticks, for example. I mean, this is how early Asian Americans were treated and viewed. I mean, as an oddity, of course. I mean, there just weren't many of them in the United States, which was very white and very Protestant at this point. But the real wave of immigration starts in the late 1840s in California with Chinese Americans and later Japanese Americans about 2 or 3 decades later. And while there's some initial welcoming of them, very quickly it turns on them. White Americans turn on them. And in the 1850s, you get a governor in California, John Engler, who says the republic really is for one race only, and that's whites. What do Asian Americans do? Immediately, the Chinese Americans do the proper thing, which is ferociously fight back. They go to court. They lobby legislators. There's one famous example of a letter from one Chinese immigrant to the United States in California in the 1850s, when the governor says this republic is for one race only. This very intelligent Chinese American writes a letter saying, Governor Engler, this is false in the extreme, and you know it. So right away, they begin pushing back. And this begins to bear fruit in some cases and not others. Chinese and Japanese Americans, though, suffer through a century of discrimination. But basically, it was a fourfold strategy. One was what I just mentioned, a pushback strategy almost from day one, where they go to court, they lobby politicians, and in very sort of, in environments that are not to their, that are not helpful to them, right? Many of them can't vote. They're not citizens unless they're born in the United States. Their children are born in the United States. So it's very difficult to fight back. Nonetheless, they do. So that's strategy number one. Strategy number two, so they don't think of themselves as victims from the get-go. They say, we're going to fight back. Then also, you see that Asian Americans, Japanese Americans, and Chinese Americans are highly entrepreneurial, in some cases because they have to. They're prevented from joining many occupations. They can't become lawyers. They can't become doctors in some cases. So in essence, they're forced to become entrepreneurs. And some of them, though, also early Chinese Americans, early Chinese immigrants to the United States, bring these skills directly from China, where there's not a culture of entrepreneurship, or it's not encouraged, and they are entrepreneurs. So America is already benefiting from early Chinese immigration, and they use these skills in America. That helps them succeed in America right away, but over time as well. Another factor for Chinese and Japanese Americans, I'd say in particular, is that they're focused on integration in America. There was heavy discrimination, for example, against Chinese and Japanese Americans among labor unions. Labor unions were racist, like other white Americans at the time. They wouldn't let Japanese Americans join. There was a famous labor leader of Japanese Americans who set up his own labor organization, but kept trying to incorporate it into American labor organizations, and they kept rejecting it, but he kept trying. So there's this focus on trying to integrate into the United States. They didn't want to set them apart. Japanese and Chinese Americans did not want to set themselves apart from mainstream America, because that would have been giving into the racists. And this, by the way, is very different than today, where people are often, again, retreating to pure cultural silos. which I think is tragic, because again, it goes against I think the Martin Luther King goal of integration and the early Japanese and Chinese American goal of integration. And then lastly, what's fascinating is when I'm looking at the research and I'm looking at how Chinese and Japanese Americans fought back, but also early successes. By the 1920s, you look at education and the results, and you see that Chinese and Japanese Americans, who are the bulk of Asian Americans at this point in American history, by 1920 and 1930 are already attending school and graduating from university at rates much higher than white Americans. And it's because of the emphasis on education. So Asian Americans, early Asian Americans, despite being handicapped by prejudice in the political system and the courts which back it up, and horrific legislation, and of course in the case of the Japanese Americans in the 1940s put into internment camps, despite these really horrific discriminatory, prejudicial actions against Asian Americans, they were already succeeding by the 1920s and by the 1930s because of their strategy to really push back consistently, because of their entrepreneurial orientation, in part again because sometimes they have to, but because also they focus on that, because of the desire for integration and their focus on that. And eventually this pays off. And lastly, because of their focus on education. So these four elements are really what helped East Asians succeed in the United States. And frankly, it forced America as a country, as a republic, to live up to its founding ideals, which is really the tremendous positive aspect of all that happened, is that Asian Americans finally got other Americans to live up to their ideals from 1776.
But maybe we're even seeing Asian Americans become victims of their own success, because we've heard of court action against Harvard because they're now discriminating against Asians because Asians are doing so well and getting admitted in such large numbers that
Right.
Harvard would like less diversity in terms of less Asians.
Right.
So
Right.
talking about victimhood.
Yeah, well, thank you for bringing that up, Lindsay. You're right. This is another part of the victim cult, where I pointed the irony, and one of the problems with victim cults is what? They don't look at you as an individual, right? They simply say, well, you're part of the tribe that once oppressed my tribe. And so everybody becomes part of a collective again. And this has been the problem in human history. We don't look at people as individuals. Now, in a liberal democracy, the vision of Martin Luther King, we're supposed to look at people as individuals. We're supposed to look at their character. But what's happened, and this is the problem with, I would say, not actual liberalism, not classical liberalism, but this is the problem with modern progressives, who they've abandoned the liberal vision of Martin Luther King, and they have again, since the 1960s, started to look at people as part of a collective. So you're Black American or white American or Asian American or indigenous. And people look at you as that first, not as individual. And universities like Harvard, again, out of a good place, they say, well, Black Americans are not attending at the rate that we'd like them to. But what do? They discriminate against Asian Americans with, what is it, a personality, not a personality test, but some sort, it's a kind of I think they call it a holistic test. Well, this is reminiscent of the 1920s, where Harvard didn't like the fact that there were too many Jews attending, where there was a greater proportion of Jews, about 30% in Harvard, far higher than the proportion of the population. And Harvard at this point is very waspy. It's very white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, and mostly male. And so they designed another holistic test, or did the first holistic test in the 1920s, to cut down on the number of Jews attending Harvard, and tragically it's successful. They repeat this 90 years later. Again, in this particular case, unlike the 1920s, Harvard thinks it's acting out of a good motive, and I guess it is. But the end result is that Asian Americans are kept away from attending Harvard in a proportion they otherwise would. So in the book, I chronicle this as a great irony, where we've come full circle in a negative way, where again, people are being treated as part of their collective, which is crazy. I mean, if you're an Asian American, I mean, I give an example in the book. If you're maybe your parents are, maybe one of your parents was British, with a pale face. Your other parent was, I don't know, Korean. Does that mean you should be treated as an Asian American or as a non-Asian American? Maybe you're a capitalist. Maybe your religion is Buddhism. Like, what's your primary identity as a person? I mean, this is why it's far more important to look at people as individuals and treat them as individuals in law and policy, rather than artificially look at people as and say, well, I'm sorry, you're the wrong collective, part of the wrong collective today. I mean, one of the things in the book that I do is I look at the tragedy of Rwanda, where Hutus, who were discriminated against by the Tutsis before independence, once the Hutus take over, have a program of discrimination against the Tutsis and really a propaganda campaign against the minority Tutsis. And we know where that got to in 1994. But back to a more positive result. Look, we've got examples of where Asian Americans or Jewish Americans say, listen, we're not going to put up with this, and we're going to succeed, because we're going to force this republic, or in the case of Canada, we're going to force everyone else around us to live up to their ideals, and they do. And that's the most positive part of this, is they actually believed in human agency. Whether it's Jewish American or Jewish Canadian or Asian Americans or Asian Canadians, whether it's Ellis Ross and the Highs of the First Nation, they look at themselves and look at others as individuals first and part of a collective second, and say, how can we get past the wrongs that have happened in the past? And not to be glib about it, but one has to do that, because if you only focus on the past, again, you're caught in this whirlpool of trying to resurrect something that may not have been ideal in the first place, but certainly won't help you today in the modern world.
All right. Maybe as a last question, so your last chapter, it's called Two Wars and Two Families, A Personal Reflection. So you talk a bit about your personal connection to the notion of victimhood. So do you want to just briefly touch on that before we wrap it up here?
Sure. So one of my grandparents, Lydia, who was 3 years old in 1914 rather, her and her parents, and I think she had like 10 some siblings, want to leave for Canada. They end up leaving Ukraine, where she would have been on a farm with some fruit trees and some animals. They end up going to Latvia in July 1914. They're almost ready to leave for Canada, to the land of opportunity. Turns out somebody has some eye disease, so they have to stay around for 2 weeks. At the end of that 2 weeks, they don't get to leave for Canada because war has broken out, what turns out to be the First World War. They have to go back to the Ukraine. As the war goes on, they have to leave for Siberia because Ukrainians don't like Germans. They think they're going to be disloyal. They think they're going to be a fifth column. In Siberia, 5 years later, in 1920, the Bolsheviks, the communists, take over. They're forced to flee again. My grandmother, as it turns out, throughout 13 years before they finally get to Canada in 1927, was a victim multiple times over. She never learned how to read. My grandfather, who she met when she came to Canada later, is also a victim when I think back about it. He comes to Canada. He tells his mother and his father to bring the entire family over, and my great-grandmother, being stubborn German, says, no, I was born in Poland, my children are born in Poland, I'm going to die in Poland. Well, his brothers are killed during the war. They join the German army because they're Germans in a section of Poland that's German, either enthusiastically, we don't know, or reluctantly drafted, we don't know. We know that his brothers died in the war. This is a tragedy for my grandfather and his family, and his mother, my great-grandmother, eventually comes over to Canada anyway, and he says to my grandmother, if only you'd come over when I asked you to. But he was never a bitter man. He never let this sour him. Neither my grandmother nor my grandfather looked back to those days and let it handicap their ability to thrive in Canada. And my point in this chapter, the last chapter of the book, is I think actually my grandfather's choices, my grandmother's choices, had a lot more to do with their success or failure in Canada. He was a small-time house builder in Kelowna back when it was nothing but a blue-collar town with maybe 15,000 people in the 1950s, 1960s. That's how he made his living. He'd build a house, he'd sell it. He owned a lot of property at one point, I guess, in Kelowna, which wasn't worth much, but he sold it in bits and bits. He probably could have been a very wealthy man. There's a college now there. There's apartment buildings. There's a school. His own choices led to his fortune or not, but he was a modest person with modest ambitions. He never wanted to be rich, and that's fine. My point in this chapter, though, is he could have looked back and said, I was a victim of this or a victim of that. And in fact, he was, as was my grandmother. She never learned how to read. But I never remember either one of them being bitter. Instead, what I remember is they simply kind of got on with life. And I remember this. I lived in Kelowna until the 1990s and until they passed away in 1996 and 1997. And what I remember from my grandparents more than anything else throughout their entire life is not only did they not complain about what happened to them in their lives, I remember they always planted gardens. So I remember red roses. They had some beautiful red roses in the front of their house in the lawn out there, on the lawn, surrounding the lawn rather. And in the back of their house, they had fruits and vegetables. And some of them were the exact same fruits and vegetables that my grandmother in particular would have remembered from her time as an early child in Ukraine. And so this to me is the possibility. This is what's positive. If you can, we can't really stop people from becoming victims, ourselves or others. That's the tragedy of life, unfortunately. But because I remember my grandmother and the fruit and vegetables that she planted in that back garden and how her and my grandfather tended those until their very last days, I think in the back of her mind, maybe she was trying to bring the best from her past, from Ukraine. She remembered, the sweet smells of these flowers and the sight of them, the red roses, and also the corn and the rhubarb and the peaches, the sweet taste of a peach. This is what she brought from her past, not the best, not the worst, but the best. So to me, that's the story, the positive story of the victim cult, is that if you can move past that, if a society can move past that, there really is potential to flourish.
I think that's a lovely note to end this interview on. So thank you so much, Mark. Remember, Mark's book is called The Victim Cult. It's now on Amazon.com. I'm sure our listeners' interest is piqued now. And it'll be in bookstores very soon. So thanks again, Mark. Can we find you on social media anywhere?
You can find me on LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter and markmilke.com. Thank you, Lindsay.
Great. Yeah, thank you. See you later.